All right, if I could have Governor Ridge join me here. So Governor Ridge, here, let me grab my... Governor Tom Ridge here doesn't need much of an introduction. Okay, perfect. Governor Ridge doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'm going to try to make one anyway, because I feel like it wouldn't be right otherwise. So Governor Ridge, longtime governor of Pennsylvania, as a former resident of Pennsylvania, it's an honor to join you here, sir. But it's just been, you've had a storied career, going back to your service in the Vietnam War, being drafted and earning a Bronze Star of Valor out of Harvard University. What a career! I mean, you have your time as the governor there, and then in 2001, following the attacks of 9/11, named the director of the Office of Homeland Security, serving there 2 years before it became a cabinet level position, becoming the secretary of the department. So I don't think we need much more, but
well, if you look at it, you say the guy can't hold a job.
Governor Ridge now serves as the chairman of Ridge Global and also works with APCO Worldwide as a senior advisor. Yep. So, what we wanted to do is kind of talk about where DHS has been and where it's going during our time here with you today. So let's start there. How do you believe the role of the Secretary for Homeland Security has changed from 2003 to today?
Well, I think first of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here, and to all of you who are presently in public service. I know you got a lot of private sector here, but for those of you who are probably public service, I just want to say thank you, particularly in light of the challenges that you face now, because it's a far more perilous world today than it was in 2001. Not only has the terrorist threat metastasized and become far more complex and geographically far more diverse, but the traditional nation-state kind of adversaries have exploded with Russia and China and Iran, and the destabilization of Europe, and the list goes on. And then finally, the world in which you live in is so dramatically affected by the digital, what I call the digital forevermore. Article 1, I think Section 8, it gives Congress the right to declare war. Well, we're not going to do it, but we're at war. It's a digital war. When I was in the military, it was air, land, and sea. Then we went to space. The fifth theater of war is the digital space, and we're in one, and it's not declared. I don't want to be breathless or alarmist about it, but the Chinese and the Russians actually in their written doctrine, war-fighting doctrine, relate to that as a component. We know that Rouhani in Iran has gone to universities recruiting cyber warriors to defeat their adversaries. So all of you out there in the in the public sector working on this digital challenge, I want to tip my hat to you. A lot of people go to work every day and they add value to our economy. They make widgets, gadgets, and gadgets. They offer services, but you go to work protecting the infrastructure and your government. And I don't want to demean anything anybody else does, but when you park your car, I was out at NASA the other day, and there was just literally thousands of cars, and I thought, what a great mindset. I got to tell these folks, when they go to work, their job, although they're not wearing a military uniform, is to help protect America. And I think we need to understand and respect that a little bit more than we do. Let's face it, the digital world the digital opportunities to disrupt for political or geopolitical reasons is real. We've done it. We can't walk into equity court and say, well, we've never done it. It's called SuckNet, when we tried to slow down Iranian's nuclear program. So Teddy Roosevelt once said, one of the best prizes in life is to work hard at work worth doing. Well, those of you in this digital world, on behalf of the government, you work hard. But I got to tell you, it's work worth doing, so I tip my hat to you. The challenges at DHS have just grown exponentially. I think my successors have had to deal with not only trying to work with Congress as they still try to get the department arranged the way they'd like it, and it has become the political piñata in this town, which I take great offense to. You got a problem with immigration? Let's blame DHS. You got a problem at the airport? It's TSA. It's DHS. It's a favorite whipping post for the Congress of the United States. And only until they're able to reduce the jurisdictional oversight of the department and get people who understand how it's all connected, will we ever be able to maximize the collective energy, effort, and intellect of the department. So my successors, I thought I had a tough job. I think my successor's job has been more complicated than mine. But I'm glad President Bush called me. By the way, we wrote the job description after I said yes. So if you're going to do a job interview, figure out what you're getting into before you say yes.
So back during those years, in 2003, I looked up the statistic. It was estimated, according to a CNN article, cybercrimes cost the country $16 billion, or I should say worldwide. Last year, it was $6 trillion.
Yep.
So how have you seen digital threats evolve over the past 15 years?
Well, I think we all know who the actors are. I mean, your nation states, your hacktivists, your organized crime. Frankly, some of them are devoting more assets than, frankly, we do in this country, at least from a government level. And the other thing I think we need to understand about the digital world is, I'll bet just about everybody in here is wearing a watch. We have watches. The digital hackers and actors have time. So they'll play around in the network. They're probably already in most of the networks, looking for that vulnerability. As the internet, John Chambers said it right, it's not the internet of things, it's the internet of everything. I've seen some incredible estimates that by 2020, there'll be 20 billion devices hooked up to the internet. And I saw another estimate that said 50 billion. Now, I don't know whether it's 20 or 50. I'm a guy from Erie, Pennsylvania. All I know, it's a lot. And the other thing I know is everyone is a potential point of access into the internet. And so I think we need to understand that they're patient. They're changing their technology. We're finding more and more often that they're designing malware for a particular target. It used to be generic malware we tried here and there. Again, some of these are organized and supported by government. They've got research dollars. They literally have thousands and thousands of people working on it. And others are just organized crime where their government looks the other way. So the digital sun, let me put it this way, the digital sun's never going to set. It's just going to get hotter and hotter, which means it'll be more aggressive, more tools, more sophisticated. And while I appreciate what Homeland Security is trying to do to build those relationships with the private sector, and they need to do that, the most important thing that the government can do for the private sector is share information as quickly as possible. That's the most important thing they can do, and help accelerate the construction of these information sharing analysis centers. You got telecom's got a good one. Financial services has one of the best. Energy's starting to work, but the other sectors are kind of slow. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But we need to understand, without being breathless, we're at war. It's not going to get easier. It's going to get harder. And the other thing the private sector, I think, needs to understand, you're not going to have, the government can give you information, and there's a lot of companies, listen, what we did, pardon the monologue, but let me
by all means.
When we worried about physical threats way back when, 02, 03, you say, okay, can you identify the threat? Can you detect it? Can you prevent it? And if all else fails, then you got to respond and recover. I think one of the challenges today in the mindset is we're spending a little bit too much time on respond and recover, and we're not spending enough time on, can we identify the threat? Can we detect it and prevent it? And I will tell you, if you take a look at the statistics, the greatest point of vulnerability is either your employees or your third-party contractors have access to your network. Now, you don't need the government to tell you that. I just did, and it was free. But we need to understand that. I mean, this year so far, there have been 4 or 5 interesting developments. There were like 140 or 150 universities in the United States were attacked, and they got through because several professors just went fishing. Professors went fishing. Or third-party contacts. They get it through. I mean, we all know, I guess, was targeted through the heating, ventilation, air conditioning. So private sector has to start thinking, not just who do I call if something happens. You got to start worrying on the front end. The barbarians are no longer at the gate. They're exquisitely concealed. You need to understand that and act on it before you have to pick up the phone and call somebody and say, help me. I've been hacked.
No, absolutely. One of the big focuses that we've seen with cybersecurity, one of the big concerns is protecting critical infrastructure. Yep. I think you certainly had an interesting situation in August of 2003 when we had the Northeast blackout. Yep. And that wasn't necessarily because of a cybersecurity attack. It was more because of a tree limb, right? But at the same time, it shows how when the lights go out across the entire Northeast, what are some of the implications of that? Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about
I love that.
Maybe the phone call that you had?
It's a story I say with a smile on my face, although it affected 55 million people who didn't have energy for like 2 weeks or 2 days. I'm out and about, and I get a call from the White House, and obviously the operator says the president's on the line. By the way, I knew the president from our days as governor. I called him one time when the Steelers were playing the Cowboys for the Super Bowl. And I said to him, I don't want Pennsylvania Iron City beer for Texas beef. I want a manly wager. And he said, what's that? And I said, well, Mr. President, if the Steelers win, I get your legislature and you get mine. You don't understand that. Mine in Pennsylvania meets all year long, every year. His meets every 90 days, every 2 years. I want his instead of mine. Well, it didn't work out. By the way, the Steelers won. So he called me. And he said, we just had a power failure. What happened? Well, Mr. President, could you give me an hour and I'll get back to you? We had set up in the early days of the department both a protocol procedure whereby if something like this incident occurred, and we didn't know the magnitude of the incident, I think maybe you remember it. It's August of '03. A tree limb falls, I think, north of Cleveland, knocks down a power line. There were some bad decisions made along the way, but Canada was hit, Cleveland on, and like 55 million people affected. And what we said is we had key people from every agency that we thought would be required in an event of a natural emergency. Get as much information as you can, so within an hour, I can get back to the president and brief him and keep going on. Now, that was a tree limb and a couple of bad decisions with regard to redirecting energy, and 55 million people were without electricity for at least 2 days. Now, what you don't know, and what they don't know at DHS, even way back in the nascent days when we're trying to deal with Congress, we're trying to build the department, when we used to red cell physical attacks, occasionally we would throw in, even in '03 and '04, a simultaneous digital attack. And you have no reason to know this, but these energy companies and the grid get hit thousands of times a day. And frankly, the energy companies are doing a pretty good job. I mean, getting hit is a little bit different than exfiltrating information. But the enemies, and these are nation states more often than not, they only have to they can ping you 1,000 or 10,000 times. All they have to do is find one point of entry and then lie in wait. And so that's why, while there's a lot of public response and public attention to how do we respond and recover, I think we should be paying as much attention on the front end as well. And start with educational awareness. It's phishing. It's negligent use of passwords. It's third-party access. It's limiting access to certain components of your network to just people who have a need to know. There's certain basic fundamental things that a lot of people and a lot of companies still aren't doing.
No, absolutely. And speaking of energy companies, you sit on a board for Exelon, and that's one of just a few boards you're working on with private industry right now. Excuse me.
Well, I mean, it's the largest nuclear fleet, in the country, and they're on top of it. I mean, they spend, and that's one thing the public-private sector doesn't get credit for. They spend billions of dollars on cybersecurity, in spite of what some people may think. I'm not saying it's all well spent. A dollar amount doesn't necessarily relate to effectiveness, but and I know what Exelon does, and all the other companies are doing it as well. Mm-hmm.
Do you believe
that's the other challenge? One more.
Oh, sure.
It's the interdependency, though, of our economy. I mean, you can't view the electric grid in isolation from everything else, because if it goes down, everything else goes down. And look what just the tree limb in Cleveland. I hope you weren't in an elevator in New York City. God forbid you were on the operating table in a hospital. So we just have to think a little bit more completely about the impact of a cyber attack as it affects our critical infrastructure. Imagine shutting down overnight payment system and Fed, what it does to the economy. So anyhow, I'm preaching to the choir, but I haven't heard any amens yet, so amen.
There you go.
Thank you,
we
brother.
got a couple. Well, you mentioned the investment that private industry is making right now, especially the companies like Exelon, energy companies, banks, and what have you. From your perspective of sitting on those boards right now, do you think that government's taking, some of the government agencies are taking advantage of those investments in the right ways, and making it easy for some of the breakthroughs that are happening in private industry be utilized from a government perspective to protect against? I mean, you mentioned how many times energy companies get attacked. I mean, how many times does Department of Homeland Security get attacked every day? I mean, it's in the millions, right? So, I mean, that's my question to you. Do you think that the government's doing a good enough job yet to take advantage of those breakthroughs?
Well, I've always been a big believer, I suspect everybody in the audience is, of public-private partnership. I mean, and if I had my way, I would figure out a way to get some of the brightest technical minds that are in the private sector now to become dollar-a-year people and work with the federal government to help build out a far more robust national approach toward cybersecurity. It's a tremendous burden to think that DHS, no matter how well-intentioned those people are, can really affect the kind of national change that you want, because their reach is still limited. The number of employees is limited. The skill sets are good, but they're not as broad or as deep as the private sector. And I'd like to see down the road a much more robust and visible engagement and use of the private sector at the federal level to try to build out these systems. Roosevelt was able to get from the major industrial companies when we got involved in World War II, a lot of people to come to Washington for $1 a year or whatever. And they helped lead and direct and organize our response to that threat. I think this is that level, although we haven't declared a war. And I don't know who it would be, and there's millions of people out there that are a lot smarter than I am when it comes to the technical side of this challenge. But I do think that building a national strategy and bringing in some of the best capabilities within the private sector is probably the best way to deal with this permanent condition that will only get more intense. The digital sun will never set. It's just going to get hotter. And so we have to think a little bit differently now than perhaps we have at earlier times, given the nature of earlier threats, because we are all connected.
Okay. So you mentioned a little bit about getting people to work, with the government and getting some of the top tech talent there. what are some more ways that some of these different agencies can do to recruit? We're not just talking, CEOs and whatnot to do national strategies, but even somewhat in the lower level to get some of the programmers, developers, some of the folks that are sitting out in the crowd right now who work with organizations. We're going to have the U.S. Digital Service speak after you. So that's a good example of where we've seen some of those initiatives to bring some of these folks into government. Can more be, do you feel that more needs to be done within that area? Sir?
Well, because I spent a lot of my life in public service and I speak and have dealt with a lot of men and women who've done the same thing, most people work for government. They've got a passion. The part of their DNA is about service. It just is. And you don't necessarily do it because you expect to become wealthy. You do it because you have a sense of service. You feel good about working for government. I don't care at the local level, the federal level. It's in the DNA. Some people just have that. I do think in certain positions we have to think about salary, pay. I mean, the attractiveness my God, who'd you rather work for, DHS or Facebook? Now, I personally don't have a Facebook account. It'd be a cold day before I ever get one. It's just generational for me and how, I thought it was an interesting question. Cambridge Analytica got all that, so I'm not sure they're necessarily the guys who bring in to tell us how to create a secure infrastructure. But having said that, there are technical people out there with great minds and great capabilities, and there's a lot of technical people in the federal government have that, so that allures there. So I don't know if we can figure out how do we do a pay structure variable, even if it's regional. Might make a difference, like we do with some of the TSA folks. A regional difference might help keep people. You want to attract the best, but you also want to keep them. I'm a big believer, we have such a technologically oriented military. I'd like to figure out a way to transition some of these incredible men and women into that space. And, I think we have to be very creative in terms of how we can embed some of the private sector people with private sector pay into these operations to help us build out. And we have to get around this mindset, because if I bring somebody in from Apple or Facebook or Microsoft or Amazon or this or that somehow, once they're inside the government, their sole purpose will be to advance their own corporate agenda. I don't believe that. And I believe you can make sure that doesn't happen. So I think and we also have to, again, I think we have to be very creative in how we can blend, attract, retain, maybe the military, maybe pay differential, and then let's figure out a way to embed some of the brightest minds in the private sector, keep them on that private sector payroll to work hand in glove inside the federal government.
Okay. I think we only have a couple more minutes left, but I wanted to save some time for questions from the audience for Governor Ridge. If you could hold up your hand, we have a couple microphones. So does anyone have any questions for the governor while we have him here? Right here in the second row.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the idea of deterring some of that activity against both the government and the private sector. There's the question of whether cyber deterrence is even kind of a functional concept, whether having cyber weapons that could be used does convince an adversary not to try to get into a network or attack, or whether deterrence really should only remain in the sort of kinetic sphere. Do you believe that deterrence can prevent those adversaries from getting into networks, or are they going to get in no matter what, and the goal is just to mitigate what they get?
The other question was about cyber. Do I believe in the concept of cyber deterrence? I do. More importantly, I don't think the burden should be on the private sector to develop and use those tools. I, for one, once we discovered that North Korea had hacked into Sony for the second time, I wish when Kim Jong-un had opened either his laptop or his iPad one morning, he had the American flag waving in front of him and the Star Spangled Banner, our national anthem, playing behind him, basically saying, look, dude, we know what you're up to. We can get into your network, and the next time you do this, there'll be serious retaliation. I think you have to be selective. I have to be strategic. I don't mean to demean that. But I do think that those who would do us harm digitally have to understand, appreciate we do have the same capability. And it's like, so I'm a proponent of the deterrent, selectively used. And frankly, while it's a world of great transparency, this is not something I think necessarily that the general public ought to know that we're using.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question here, right here in the front. Quintus.
Hi, good morning,
Morning.
Governor. Thank you very much. That digital. So thank you very much. I just tweeted out the digital sun will never set; it'll only just get hotter. So you'll see that on Twitter here in a little bit. Whether it's a nation-state actor or a hacktivist or even just a criminal enterprise, ultimately what the bad guys want is data. And a couple of the sectors, not necessarily finance or telecom, but healthcare has a lot of rich data with personal information, personal health information, publicly, PII,
Yeah, got it,
yeah. So what do you think can be done in terms of DHS working with some of the health-focused agencies, FDA to secure devices or CMS to secure, Medicaid, Medicare data to make sure that the nation-state actors don't get a new entry point, or at least we can minimize and mitigate their threat, protecting the data?
Well, I have a slightly different twist in response to your question. I think the most important thing, again, you can give to any healthcare provider is any information that you have, a precursor, some malware, just put it out there in the system. I think you can encourage and support and accelerate the ISAC for the healthcare industry. It's kind of lagging behind the last time I checked. And it's still up to the CEOs and the boards of directors and everyone to understand that they have it. I know people don't understand that information has value on the black market. It's enormously valuable. I'm going to file a false insurance return. I'm going to file for a false Medicare or Medicaid claim. And it's going on all the time. So I think probably the most important thing DHS can do is engage them probably more rhetorically to encourage, to oversee. We started NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, a couple years came out with just a basic, I think it's really basic outline of the kinds of things that companies across the board should do as they try to pay attention to the first three to identify the threat, detect it, and prevent it, those three cases. But I still think if you wait for the government in any capacity to help you shore up your defenses, I think it's a mistake. I think the best thing they can do is accelerate information, help you accelerate your growth of the ISAC, and to the extent that they're the smaller healthcare companies need some guidance, I'm sure that they're willing to do it. But I don't think I don't think any industry or any company should be looking to the federal government to help them figure out what they need to do. It's as clear as the nose on your face. There are certain precautionary measures, and you ought to start with educational awareness, digital hygiene, and this notion of just having a firewall, forget it. You have to layer in multiple defenses. And after that, I would say, ladies and gentlemen, it's a risk you are managing because you can't eliminate it. But also understand that it's a dynamic environment. So don't be satisfied today that you're done for the rest of the year. Based on new information or anything else that you may learn in that sector, you may have to do something different with your infrastructure and your network. So I don't want to demean the role of the government. I think there's a role. They use the CERT at Carnegie Mellon. NIST is doing some things. But right now, the government seems to be primarily interested in penalizing people for not doing what they think is appropriate. I prefer the exhortation, and let's try to work with these sectors to make sure that they're doing these basic, but I think very, very important preventive measures. We spend too much time on reaction, not enough time on prevention.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Governor Ridge, for joining us.
Thanks all very much.
This morning. I appreciate your comments. great to have that perspective. So, thank you very much.